in the few years that you've been away, there have been some excellent fights. We have the Wilder and Fury trilogy was excellent, obviously. We just saw what Terrence Crawford did to Errol Spence. Is there a fight over the past few years that you saw that you said, wow, I kind of wish I was on the call for that? Because I'll never forget. I was at Pacquiao Marquez and I watched it several times when I got home and listening to Roy tell you he's not getting up, Jim, is one of the most famous lines that we've heard. But is there one of those fights of the past 4 years that you said to yourself, wow, that would have been a fun one to call?
The human story of Canelo Alvarez, along with the boxing story, something to which I was close. We were neighbors in Del Mar, California for several years. I used to run into Chepo, his chief trainer at the grocery store. I knew people who saw him training his horses and riding horseback for an hour and a half, 2 hours in the morning before he went to the gym for 3.5 hour boxing workouts. So I was constantly aware of his unusual arc and what a multifaceted person he is. And I would love to have continued to cover the story of Canelo. And now I'm going to get a chance to go back to ringside and do exactly that.
A lot of people think that Jermell Charlo is biting off more than he can chew by moving up 2 weight classes against a guy who is a pound for pound great. What is your insight on this fight? Because Jermell does still have a height and a reach advantage. He is knocked out, I believe, 8 of his last 9 victories have come by knockout. What do you think? Is it really him biting off more than he chew, or how do you see this matchup going style-wise?
That's conventional logic. But he is a guy who might conceivably be better at 168. We don't know for sure whether that is unreachably outside of his weight envelope. That might conceivably be his best weight. How many people would have said, 3-4 years ago, well in advance of when it took place, 5 years ago, how many people would have said Canelo will beat up Sergey Kovalev? Not many people would have jumped at that. Canelo began, I believe, as a 135-pound fighter. So migration up the weight scale is something that has been a part of the sport for a long, long time. Some fighters, like Hearns, can do it, and some fighters can't. And we don't know yet which one of those types Canelo is. Charlo is. And we don't know whether Jermell is better at it than Jermall would have been. I had a conversation yesterday with Tony Harrison. Tony Harrison's an old friend for obvious reasons. He was Emmanuel's last beloved protege. I can remember a time when Tony came in his period of grieving after Emmanuel died and stayed at my house in Del Mar. And we consoled each other, et cetera. And so I called Tony yesterday because he had 2 fights with Jermell. And I asked him exactly the question you're posing. I said, do you give him a chance against Canelo? He said, oh, hell yes, I have to give him a chance against Canelo. He's athletic. He can whack. He said the same thing I said. We don't know what he is at 168. He might be better. So these are mysteries. And they're part of what makes the sport so intriguing. And we're going to find out on the night of September 30 in the ring whether Jermell Charlo is a 154-pound fighter who's made a tactical error here, or whether he's possibly a 160 or 168-pound fighter who's moved into a more comfortable envelope.
It's a very fascinating story to think about all the things, the variables that are at play at this fight. Another one who jumped up, Michael Spinks, when he beat Larry Holmes, and Larry was undefeated at the time, chasing Rocky Marciano's record. And Michael Spinks out there, he shocked the world. And Michael Spinks was always considered a small heavyweight when he moved up.
How about the Michael Spinks who, in front of my eyes, when I was calling fights for ABC, jumped on Jerry Cooney and kicked his ass in Atlantic City? He looked like a fly in there against Cooney, and he tore him up. So you can't start out with the premise that just because a guy has some higher level weight advantage, he's definitely going to win the fight. That isn't necessarily the case.
Canelo Alvarez, his last 3 fights, we've seen what some people have called a decline, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily true or not. His punch output is shrinked a little bit. He didn't look particularly great against John Ryder in his fight. Gennady Golovkin, who has never been knocked out before, and people for whatever reason expected him to knock him out that night, didn't happen. But But then the Bivol fight, he lost that fight pretty handily. From your observation, do you think we may be seeing a Canelo in decline, or is this just style matchups that aren't working out in his favor the way that people anticipate they would?
We still don't know. And, his win in the third Golovkin fight was very logical. It was exactly what you would have expected. I mean, in the first two fights, they both hit each other with a large number of monstrous shots, and nobody was ever close to going down. So they proved their chins against each other, and there was no reason to think that something different was going to happen in the third fight. There was reason to believe that Canelo was still the liver body at that point in their arcs, and that's what turned out to be the case. It wasn't a rampaging runaway win. It was a win. Bivol, that was a matchmaking error. To me, a very clear matchmaking error. I had a very strong sense, I covered Bivol at HBO, had a very strong sense going into that fight that Canelo was the one who was biting off more than he could chew. He underestimated that Bivol was longer. Bivol's a terrific athlete. Bivol has all of the kind of craft that you expect from well-schooled Eastern European fighters with deep amateur backgrounds, etc. I don't think that was an upset. I think that was a logical win. The only upset was that Bivol got a fair shake from Nevada scorers and maybe became the first Eastern European fighter to get the fair shake, although a lot of ringside observers thought, no, those scores are too close. He won by a larger margin than that. And I wasn't there to watch in person, so I'm not going to dispute that opinion. But at the end of the day, the questions that I think we're looking at next Saturday night, which are endemic to the careers of all great fighters like Canelo. At what point has he made enough money? At what point has he bought enough beautiful thoroughbred horses and had the privilege of training them on his ranch or ranches? At what point has he been treated to enough royal privilege by the moneyed aristocracy of Mexico that he doesn't quite need to expend as much effort anymore? And one thing I always say to people about boxing is this is a cumulative experience. If you reach that point in your career where you are just satisfied enough within your constitution that you come to the gym every day for 6-8 weeks, whatever it is, and you're 2% less than you used to be, you might wind up stepping into the ring at 10 or 12% less than you used to be. And this is not a sport with wide competitive margins. When you see a first round knockout, it's not because there was a giant competitive margin. It's because somebody made a mistake and the other person was good enough to take advantage of it with some particular skill set or physical advantage that he had at that moment. But at the end of the day, the reason a lot of fights go 12 rounds and we wind up wondering what the judges are going to say is that these are fine margins of competition. And so I don't know. I mean, that's the wonderful mystery of this fight is which Canelo shows up. Has he had enough? It's been a long career, a very long career.
It definitely has. And I'm glad you brought up the Bivol fight and the scorecards, because this was going to lead into my next question is, does Jermell Charlo have to knock Canelo out? Because over the years, you've been privy to some of these scorecards that have been scored in Canelo's favor. The Floyd Mayweather fight, for instance, CJ Ross's infamous 114 score. A lot of people thought that Arasandi Lara gave Canelo all that he can handle. And those scores were in favor of Canelo. In your mind, and do you think that Charlo may have to walk into this fight thinking, I have to do more than just win 7 rounds or 8 rounds? Like, I may have to stop him, or I may have to put him down. I may have to be more aggressive than I normally am, because Charlo isn't a guy who throws a lot of punches in his fights. He picks his spots. They have to change the strategy for this particular fight.
I don't disagree with the word you said. And I think that Jermell should pay attention to that mode of thought. I think if Jermell feels like the fight is on the table in the 10th or 11th or 12th rounds, he should have in the back of his mind a memory that I am fighting the number one economic attraction in boxing, regardless of the loss to Bivol. This is still the number one dollar for dollar fighter in the sport. And being the number one dollar for dollar fighter in the sport is a more valuable identity going into a fight like this than being the number one pound for pound fighter in the sport. Canelo wants to, I'm sure, in his heart and soul, he would like to get back to number one pound for pound. So he's got to get through Charlo to get to the position to try to be number one pound for pound. But does he have the kind of hunger that Terence Crawford still has? That is, it may well be a bridge too far. Terence Crawford has reached number one pound for pound. If he could get a fight with Canelo, number one, he makes the biggest paycheck of his life by far, and a paycheck that he probably could never have envisioned for himself 6-7 years ago when I was covering him on HBO. And number two, he brings to an end one of the most glorious careers in the history of the sport and stamps himself indelibly as number one pound for pound. But I can't see Canelo turning that fight opportunity down, because what's left for him other than to get back to number one pound for pound? That has to be the big ambition. I don't think Canelo's fighting for money at this point. He's fighting for identity. And the only identity that could possibly matter, he's still the number one dollar for dollar fighter. Nothing can change that because of the size of the Mexican audience and their passion and their devotion. That's what we think. That's what we suspect that Nevada judges are conscious of when they give the benefit of the doubt to the commodity, whether he's the number one American fighter or the number one Mexican fighter. And so I think that the only logical remaining ambition for Canelo at this point is to get back to number one pound for pound. That requires that he beats Jermell Charlo, and then that he finds a way to negotiate a weight equation that Crawford can live with and fights Terence Crawford. Because to me, Terence Crawford is very clearly number one pound for pound. And now Inoue of Japan is not in a weight class where he can seek to fight Canelo.
Make sure you tune into ppv.com. Join the chat box to talk to Jim Lampley. He'll be answering your questions during the broadcast of the fight. Jim, is absolutely a pleasure to speak with you. Can't wait to... I'll be at the fight, but I'm going to probably tune in to ppv.com, and you might get a question or two from me as well while we're there. And I hope to see you in Vegas.